series. Today's lecture is on accelerating the human capital formation in the GCC. It will focus on the Human Capital Index, HCI, that the World Bank launched in October 2018, with focus on the status of the GCC countries, their challenges, and the strategies to accelerate human capital formation beyond the HCI. It is a call for action to adopt a whole government approach to invest in people's health, education, and the labor force in order to ensure a sustained and diversified economic growth. Please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Sameh Sahrati, the Program Leader of Human Development for the GCC countries at the World Bank. He is responsible for the advisory services in health, education, social protection, and jobs. For about 20 years at the World Bank, he has been providing policy advice and managing programs in human development with particular focus on health reforms, health insurance, service delivery, non-communicable diseases, and implementation science. Again, I would like to thank you for attending our KPPC lecture series. We will start now with the lecture, and we will keep the Q&A until the end. Dr. Sameh, please, the mic is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this presentation. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Khalid Mahdi, the Secretary General, who unfortunately could not be with us because he's traveling, but we are so honored that Mrs. Haifa El-Mudif, Assistant Secretary General, is chairing this session. So thank you very much for joining us. Also, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Kuwait Public Policy Center, as well as my colleagues at UNDP for organizing this session. Now, it's supposed to be a lecture and a presentation, but I would like to describe it as a journey. So we're going to start, or I'm going to take you in a journey that will have different stops. Each stop will open a window on one of the World Bank reports that culminated in the Human Capital Project report that was launched a couple of months ago in Bali in Indonesia. So, as the title says, human capital in the GCC countries towards a sustainable and diversified economy. As economists, we've known for quite some time that economic growth depends on human capital, physical capital, as well as the factors affecting the production of both. Human capital consists of the knowledge, skills, and health that people accumulate over time to make them productive in the economy. And in addition to investing in human capitals, investing in human capital also helps and equip the workforce to better utilize the physical capital. And countries that have invested heavily and consistently over time in human capital have observed tremendous gains in terms of their economic growth. Countries like Finland, South Korea, and Ireland. So the story starts with a report that the bank has launched in January 2018, early this year, called The Changing Wealth of Nations, Building a Sustainable Future. This report analyzed the assets that constitute the wealth of a country. And the report identified 4 types of assets. First, produced capital, those goods and services that a country produces. The second is human capital, that we're going to talk about in more detail. And the third is natural wealth, if you have oil, gas, or minerals. And the third is the net foreign assets. If countries have sovereign wealth funds, that is a surplus, it adds to your wealth. If you are in debt, then it is subtracted. And the finding from this report showed that the share of human capital wealth is about 2/3 of the total wealth of high-income countries. 2/3. And if we unpack this high-income countries, OECD versus non-OECD, this is the picture that we get. For high-income countries, OECD, it is 70%. Non-OECD countries, these are sort of resource-rich countries, it's only 42%. and the difference is mainly in human capital. So as you can see, the share of human capital in the GCC countries is relatively low. And this is what led the World Bank to think about the human capital project. We felt that it is important for countries to look at human capital, invest in human capital as a way of ensuring sustainable economic growth. And this is the second report, the Human Capital Project. As I mentioned, it was launched a couple of months ago. And the objective of this project is to help countries improve their education, health, and social protection systems to raise the next generation of well-equipped and healthy people. And it has three components. The first one is the Human Capital Index. And it's an index measuring countries' investment in human capital. And the second component is a measurement agenda. It's a program that improves measurement and provide analysis for effective and evidence-based investments. And lastly, the last component is country engagement, basically supporting countries to prepare national strategies that would accelerate human capital formation in these countries. So this is in a nutshell the project. Now let me go into more details about the Human Capital Index. The Human Capital Index had a number of ingredients, other measurements that compose or constitute the index. The first one relates to survival. Will children born today survive to school age? The second ingredient is regarding schooling. How long will children stay in schools and how much will they learn? And the third component is related to health. And it's about will they leave school in good health, ready for further learning and or work. The premise of this index is very simple. If a child is born today in a country, will he or she by the age of 18, when they finish school, will they be fully educated and in full health to be productive in the economy? So this is the question that this Human Capital Index is trying to answer. Now, let's look at the ingredients of this index. First, survival to age 5. As you can see, this is sort of a scatter plot of all the countries. And for the GCC countries, as you can see, it's 99%. So basically, countries are doing very well in the GCC in terms of survival, child survival. Now we come to the second ingredient, schooling. In the GCC, school children will complete between 12.1 to 13.3 years of schooling. They will remain in schools, actually attending schools, going every day to these schools. However, the amount of learning is only between 7.6 to 9.6 years. And here you have the countries and the number of years that children spend in school, and this is how much they learn. So there is a tremendous gap here that needs to be addressed. The next ingredient of the index is related to health. And there we have two measurements. One is stunting, which is height for age. And in the GCC, it's not a major issue. It is not usually even measured. And even if it's measured, it's very, very low. So the focus here is on adult survival rate. Basically, a child, when he or she reaches the age of 15, will they survive to reach age 60? So, in the GCC, between 91 and 94% of children age 15 will survive to age 60. So, it looks good. So why I say it looks good, because in a minute, we're going also to unpack this one to look at what does it entail. But in general, at the outset, I think it looks okay. So the index is the product of survival, schooling, and health, and that gives us the productivity of a future worker. So how do the GCC countries fare on this index? And here is the result. Here you have the index of the GCC countries, and next to it the ranking. Where do they rank globally? And the summary of this index for the GCC is as follows. A child who is born today in the GCC countries will only attain between 58 and 67% of his or her full health and full learning potential, and therefore potential productivity. So the contribution of children born today is expected to be only at that level. And this is sort of where the GCC stands on this global comparison. Here we have the GDP per capita, the income, and here we have the Human Capital Index score. Compared to their income, they are doing much lower than countries with similar income, like Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Germany. Same income, lower results. The results are actually similar to Vietnam, Ukraine, Mexico, Turkey, and Chile. So the GCC has the resources, but they are not fully utilized to achieve better outcomes and better results. So this is the basic, the first message. Second is that when we looked at the Human Capital Index by income groups, countries at similar income level. So the first row are high income countries, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income countries. And what we are observing here is that countries at lower level of income are achieving better results than higher income countries. For example, look here. These are upper middle income countries, right? This group is achieving higher index than this group, even though they are at a lower income level. So for the GCC, how the money is spent is equally, if not more important, on how much it is spent. Because as you can see, there are countries who are spending less and they're achieving better results. So it's important also to look at how the money is being spent on what. So for the GCC countries to improve their human capital index in the next round, in the next ranking, there are two major challenges. The first one is to improve learning outcomes for pre-tertiary education in schools. And we have the evidence. The evidence shows that this is a benchmark country. 13 years of full education and learning. And this is a country where children stay for 10 years in school, but they only learn the equivalent of 8 years. So the gap is 5 years. 5 years in gap in terms of learning. When you look at the productivity, here, this is the unadjusted and this is the adjusted. So additional year of quality adjusted education will lead to an increase of about 10% in productivity. And these are from microeconomic studies. So we looked at a different study that looked at the productivity and the correlation between learning and productivity, and this is the result. So we have the evidence that improving learning actually leads to or contributes to increased productivity. So that's one challenge that the GCC has to address. But also, it's important to improve adult survival rate. Why adult survival rate, even though it's at 92% on average, right? Okay, why? First of all, we have the evidence that improving adult survival rate by 10% leads to increased productivity by 6%, again from looking at different economic studies. So again, we have the evidence that improving adult survival rate contributes to increased productivity. The question is, what about the health of the 92% who survive beyond the age of 60? You have many people who live to 62, 65, and 70, right? But are they in full health? People who have diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, la qaddar Allah, cancer, or other chronic conditions. Do these conditions affect their productivity? Of course, yes. And the GCC actually has a high burden of non-communicable diseases that I'm going to unpack in a minute. So, this is the risk of premature death from non-communicable diseases. So the yellow columns, basically people who die early, before the age of 60. And it's not that high, that's why you have 92% survival rate, right? But look at the percentage of death from non-communicable diseases. the total death, you have between 66% and 85% death due to non-communicable diseases. And indeed, that affects the economy and that affects productivity. So for the GCC to improve their human capital index, they need to also look at not just mortality, but also morbidity, people who are living with these conditions, and try to prevent them. So this is, in a nutshell, the human capital index. But it has limitations. It does not cover everything about human capital formation as we know it from the literature and the experience. The human capital index looks at what we call the flow. Those who are born today, what will happen to them when they reach age 18. It does not address human capital formation beyond age 18. It does not address the current stock. This is just the flow. What about the stock? Those who are already living in the country, in the labor force. What can we do about it? So it's important to look at the human capital index as well as beyond. Look at the stock and the flow. Now, what does this mean? This is a lifelong approach to human capital formation, basically achieving the full potential for a productive population. This is like a framework that encompasses all of that. At the center of this framework, this is the human capital index that I just described. At the center of this framework. It has all these indicators that I just explained. Next is looking at age group 0 to 25. What are their challenges? What are those factors that affect their productivity? And here you have the list: early child development, tertiary education outcome, vocational training, road traffic injuries that kill many people at young age, and risk factors for non-communicable diseases. Then you have another circle in the framework that looks at those who are 25 years and older. And here is the list of factors that we need to address if we want to achieve the full potential of a productive population. Lifelong learning, beyond tertiary education. Skills development. We need to skill, reskill, and upskill the existing labor force, because both outcomes of tertiary education as well as the skills of the existing labor force does not match the need of the firms and of the labor market. Again, non-communicable diseases and the risk factors, labor market supply, labor market distortions, wages between public sector and private sector, the benefits. There are so many issues that affect the labor market, distortions. Female labor participation. In the GCC, you have actually girls performing better than boys in terms of test scores and attending schools and universities, yet their participation in the labor market is very low. So you have already a resource that is underutilized. And social safety nets. The purpose of social safety nets is not to help people, and that's it. It's actually to help people to get to the labor market, to be productive again. So we help them when they need help, but eventually we need also to help them to get into a productive life. And finally, disruptive technologies. Of course, as you can see, this is a broad agenda. I cannot cover everything in this, but I'm going to focus on two aspects only. And I'll be happy to answer any questions related to the rest of it. I'm going to focus on risk factors with non-communicable diseases and on disruptive technologies. And you may be wondering why disruptive technologies, or what disruptive technologies have to do with human capital. So this is sort of the framework. Also, as I mentioned earlier, countries can spend a lot of money, but they get very low outcome, right? So it's important when we think about all these policies and strategies, we look at or we consider value for money. That it's important to maximize the utility, the return on our investment. Also, You cannot just have strategies and policies without looking at the institutions, the governing structure, the regulations that will enable all these policies to be implemented. So it's important also to look at value for money as well as the governance structure in the country. And finally, most of these policies and strategies will require what we call a whole government approach. Look at any of these. Road traffic injuries, lifelong learning, skills development. It requires the collaboration of different ministries, different public and private sectors, and so on and so forth. So it requires a whole government approach, not working in silos. So let me quickly say a few words about risk factors and disruptive technologies. Why I want to focus on risk factors, particularly among youth? Because, let me even explain a little bit what do we mean by risk factors of non-communicable diseases. As I mentioned, non-communicable diseases are things like diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, cancers, and chronic pulmonary diseases. These diseases have what we call biological risk factors, like overweight, obesity, hypertension, high blood cholesterol, and so on and so forth. But before that, there are behavioral risk factors. People are behaving in such a way that lead to these biological risk factors as well as diseases down the road. And the risk factors that we know, behavioral risk factors are smoking, unhealthy food, and lack of physical activity, physical exercise, and alcohol alcohol abuse in some countries. Now, let's look at one indicator here in the GCC. 1/3 to 1/2 of young people in 4 GCC countries are either overweight or obese. This is obesity, this is overweight. Okay? Now, why we would like to focus on youth? Because, remember the stock and flow? You don't want to wait until they become diseased. You have to work on them now. And most of these risk factors are acquired at a young age. People start smoking at a young age. People don't get into the habit and routine of exercising at a young age. People acquire the bad habit of eating unhealthy food, junk food, at a young age. So we invest so much money on building hospitals, adding hospital beds, buying all kinds of medical technology down the stream. Too late. And if we continue neglecting the youth, we're going to end up more and more and more down the stream. So it's important to work upstream if you really want to have a productive youth. That's regarding the risk factors of non-communicable diseases. Oops, sorry. Okay. The other thing that I would like to talk about is digitalization, automation, and disruptive technologies. In Arabic, I've been asking around the translation of disruptive technology, and the best thing that I was able to come up with is al-teknolojia al-mukhalkhila. Why is it described this way? Because it changes the models of businesses, how business is being done, how people are interacting is going to be disrupted in a positive way. In 1956, IBM, the famous IBM company, had this disk, this hard disk. It was called IBM 350 disk drive. As you can see, it is the size of a room. And the capacity was what? 5 megabytes. This whole thing had a storage capacity of just 5 megabytes. And that led Tom Watson, who was then the chairman of IBM, to say, I think there is a world market, a global market for only 5 computers. This is what the global market will only need, and we can provide. And what happened is the following. The proliferation of technology, and this is just an example of it, in terms of the number of transistors on a microchip, on an integrated circuit. It went from 1,000 in 1970 to 20 billion transistors on a microchip. To illustrate, this is the Kingston flash drive with a capacity of 2 terabytes. just of that size. And this is happening on everything in terms of technologies. In terms of storage capacity is getting bigger, and the physical storage is getting less. Speed is increasing, prices are going down. And this is what we call disruptive technologies. The fourth industrial revolution in terms of disruptive technology has many facets. You're talking about artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed realities, blockchain, Internet of Things, drones, autonomous vehicles. The list goes on and on and on. What does this have to do with human capital? And here comes this report from the World Bank in 2016 about the digital dividends and the impact of digitalization on our world and on our future. It predicted that automation is putting at risk almost 2/3 of all jobs in developing countries. So about 2/3 of the jobs will disappear or at risk of disappearing. Then, again in Bali in October, the bank launched the changing nature of work, how the work and its nature is going to change in the future. And again, it emphasized the same message. And I just picked these two countries. The United States, that has a share of almost 1/4 of the global economy. In the United States, between 7 and 47% of jobs in the US are at risk or is at risk from being lost. Japan, the third largest economy in the world, 6%, between 6 and 55% of their jobs will be lost. And these are advanced economies. So just you can imagine what will happen in emerging economies and here in this region. Okay, again in the same report, the technological change is making jobs more intense in non-routine cognitive tasks. And this is how it relates to human capital in education and skills. The jobs of the future will require non-routine cognitive skills and routine cognitive skills, and these are increasing. And the labor force or the market is going to lose these manual jobs in different regions of the world. So this is the main message, that the changing nature of work would require equipping people and our labor force and our youth with different types of skills. So don't just think of math and science of today. You need to think of the math and science of the future. This is how human capital is going to shape productivity and wages in emerging economies. I'll try to simplify this. These are the number of potential workers. So the more you are up here, the more workers you have. And here you have the productivity in the formal sector. So the more you move into this direction, then that means the economy is more productive. So the first inverted curve, high number of people working, but productivity is low. Think of public sector employment, public sector companies. Now, as these companies or the country gets more into globalization and automation, because interacting with the global market would require a different set of skills, would require different types of productive industries and services that are able to compete with the global economy, to be part of it. So the impact of globalization and automation will give us this curve. More productivity, probably less number of workers here, but the base of the workforce has increased, and their skills have also increased. Now, so this is in a nutshell the Human Capital Index project and the need to think even beyond the Human Capital Index. Now, looking at the GCC in particular, all of the 6 countries have different visions, different vision programs. And all of them have elements of human capital. Whether it's the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, New Kuwait, the Qatar National Vision, the UAE Centennial 2071, Bahrain 2030, and Oman 2040. All of them have great visions, very comprehensive, I would say, and all of them have elements of human capital. In the next two slides, I'm just going to focus a little bit on Kuwait and putting human capital, looking at human capital or the vision from a human capital lens. So the new Kuwait vision has 7 pillars. First is effective public administration. I'm sure you already know that, so sorry to repeat it. Creative human capital. The third pillar is sustainable diversified economy. Fourth pillar is strong progressive infrastructure. Fifth is high quality healthcare. Sixth pillar is sustainable living environment. And the seventh is exceptional international position. So these are the 7 pillars in the new Kuwait vision. Let's apply the human capital lens on this vision for just a couple of minutes and see how can the picture change a little bit. So obviously, the creative human capital is part of human capital formation. And I like the description of creative because it emphasizes the need of acquiring 2 types of human capital: creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation. So creative human capital is definitely one pillar that is relevant. The second is quality of healthcare. We've been talking about health, non-communicable diseases. So again, this pillar is relevant. The third one is sustainable living environment. When we talk about air pollution, quality of the air, of the roads, places for entertainment, places for exercising, this is part of the sustainable living environment, and in my view, it constitutes part of the human capital. So basically, those 3 pillars are what I call the axis of human capital, or the mega pillar of human capital, if you will. Let's now look at the ultimate pillar that this vision is trying to achieve: exceptional international positioning. And when you read His Highness, the Emir of Kuwait, about the statement of the vision, it emphasizes making Kuwait, or aspiring to make Kuwait, a trade hub, a hub for production, for investments, for different types of services, goods and services that will attract foreign direct investment. So this is like the ultimate vision by 2030. And to achieve this vision, or this pillar, definitely you need to have strong progressive infrastructure. You need to have different types of roads, of bridges, of power plants, of telecommunication infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And definitely to have exceptional international positioning, you need sustainable and diversified economy. Telecommunication sectors, financial sectors, if you want really to diversify your economy beyond petrochemicals, not relying on oil and gas, you need to look into new sectors, and these sectors have to be attractive to foreign direct investment. So we're talking about high-end industries and high-end services. For that also you need effective public administration. There is no way you can have all of that with a weak or ineffective or an inefficient public administration services. So definitely you need, for all of that, an effective public administration. Okay, so you have the human capital pillars, and you have the other 4 pillars. Now let's connect the dots. For strong progressive infrastructure, just think of the design of this infrastructure. Think of the construction of this infrastructure. Think of the maintenance and the management of this infrastructure. It requires human capital, and not any type of human capital. For sustainable diversified economy, if you want to have a place in the global economy in terms of production, in terms of telecommunications, again, it requires skills, or people, a labor force with higher cognitive skills, as I explained earlier. And indeed, you cannot have an effective public administration by just investing in buildings, but you have to invest in people. So as you can see, to achieve the new Kuwait vision and its main 4 pillars, investing in human capital is a prerequisite to achieve this vision. So, in conclusion, to achieve sustained and diversified economy that is managed efficiently and effectively, Governments should consider spending on health, education, social safety nets, and labor, not as expenditure, but as investment. Hashtag invest in people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sameh, for a valuable information. Any question?
I'm a policy advisor on human capital at KPPC, and I enjoyed very much you sharing this presentation and the new index. I would appreciate if you please elaborate a little bit on the education component of the index, especially when you talk about the gap in years, education years, because it makes me think a little bit about the most innovative countries, where they're trying to reduce number of years or number of hours in education, and also introducing technology. So how the subcomponents or sub-indices that are used in this, to calculate that gap will inform Kuwait actually on the next reforms for the education.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Dana Al-Awadi from Manpower Governmental Restructuring Program. Doctor, I have actually 2 points. You mentioned that at the age of 18, the students should be productive. Can we define more how the student of 18 years old, they should be productive? Because I believe that they should have like a higher level of education, which is its bachelor or diploma. And the second question is, why the percentage of education is low? How can we know? One of the first slides you showed us, you said that the percentage of education in the GCC countries is low. So what did we compare with? How can we say is it low? And about the improving learning, how can we improve it? Is it by quality, the curriculums, or is it by the number of years? And if we are talking about the number of years, we are going back for my first question, which is that it says that how the 18 years old student, he's already productive or not. And they have one more point. We focus on, like, let's say the living, the health, the staying away of the diseases, all these things. Where is the community culture? Because as the GCC, you said that we have a very high, let's say, income, but we have a very low productive, comparing with another low income countries. Maybe those countries, they have a little bit different culture. So how can we change our community culture to help in all of these things? Because I believe that the community culture would help a lot, like in the food, in the eating, exercising, and a lot of these things. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, please.
Thank you, Doctor, for the really very interesting presentation. I'm Jumana Karami from the International Labour Organization, and I would like to just ask a question on the SDGs. How do you link the Human Capital Index to the SDGs?
Thank you. That was a very wonderful presentation. My concern is, how do you link the Human Capital Index to, population? I mean, in terms of birth rates. We know there are countries where the population is aging and the birth rate is very low. And specifically in GCC, how does this compare when you talk about birth to Human Capital Index? Thank you.
Okay, let me try to address these questions, and then we'll take another round. In terms of the education gap, how is it measured, right? So, how did we measure learning? In the past, we used to measure progress based on inputs. So we would measure, the number of schools, the number of beds, number of roads, and so on and so forth. Then we moved a little bit to focus more on the processes. Basically, how many years children stay in school. So this is basically the expected years of school. How many years a child stay in a school, right? Now, we looked at also the test scores of these children across countries. And we developed a harmonized database of test scores that looked at all the countries and their scores in international assessment tests, like the TIMSS and PIRLS and PISA, right? And we developed this database. And this is where we have these scores in terms of what we call quality adjusted school years. The reason we used it because we found, and this is just a hypothetical example, 2 countries where children had stayed in schools for 13 years. So in both countries, they have stayed for 13 years. But the first country, their children achieved 600 over 625, 650, which is the maximum score. A child in another country who stayed 13 years only scored 400. So the 13 years are not the same. These are different 13 years, different years of schooling, and hence we developed this school-adjusted learning, okay? Does this answer your question?
Part of it.
Okay, partly.
The second part is giving the trends and innovation and
Right.
technology. Leading countries like Norway and Finland are trying, for instance, at reducing hours of education and focusing more on the content.
Absolutely.
Fears might
Absolutely.
be-
Exactly.
Questions like how do we take this to feed into our work and effort to make
Sure. It's becoming, I mean, the message is it's a little bit irrelevant how much time you spend in school, in the classroom, and how much you spend in terms of money on schooling, right? The most important is learning. Whatever the means are, wherever the place is, when you look at early child development, early child education, and the cognitive skills and how the brain develops in the early years has a tremendous effect down the road. And this doesn't happen in schools. You need to have a pre-school education program in which the parents are involved, and that touches a little bit on the community and the role. It's not just math and science. It's social behavioral skills. It's social emotional skills. How to deal with people, how to deal in different circumstances. Those are the skills of the future. Everything that can be done by a computer will be done by computers, not by human. And human needs to acquire different types of skills. And hence, the learning is the key message. It's not the schools, okay? And that's why countries like Singapore, Finland are reducing number of schools, of attending schools, are reducing even tests, are getting away with tests. So, because they want to focus on learning, right? So yes, and we have to adopt these innovations. And by the way, I am not the expert in the field, and I feel a little bit intimidated to speak about education while I have the best expert on education sitting from the World Bank sitting in the room. So basically, they can definitely add to what I just said, and that reminds me of, it's a little bit of digression, but there was this professor, very expert in the field, who was giving lectures all over the country and all over the globe. And he had a driver that accompanied him in all his lectures. And after so many years, he said to the professor, "Professor, you know what? Actually, I've learned all types of your presentations and all the questions and how you answer them. So why don't you allow me to give the next presentation?" So the professor, "Yes, this will be a very good test." So basically, the professor went into the room and the driver was introduced as the professor. He gave the lecture, perfect. At the end of the lecture, first question he heard before, he answered it beautifully. Second question, third question, everything went smoothly until he was asked a question that he had never heard before. And he looked at the person and said, "You know what? This is a very easy question. I will let even my driver answer it." Okay, and it was the two professors. So basically, I'm here the driver, and the two professors are in the audience. Okay? So Heba, Lisa, or Richard, if you have anything to add to what I just, because I think this is an important aspect about the use of technology and the focus on learning rather than schools. Do you want to add? Yes, okay. So can you please get the mic to Dr. Heba Ahmed, who is an education economist, the true professor.
شكرا جزيلا للفرصة. In the World Bank, we view education as we don't really deal with one aspect. We think the best education reform is the one that handles the multiple aspects and inputs of the educational journey of the student. In Kuwait, there is a lot of good work that is going on right now under New Kuwait. There is the Integrated Education Reform Program, which is a program not only implemented by the World Bank, but it is implemented by so many other organizations. UNESCO, for example, is handling just the area where education links to the SDGs. So they work a lot on that, which somebody here asked about, especially SDG 4. So in the World Bank, there is another report that Dr. Sameh didn't have the time to also go through, which is the World Development Report, in which the World Bank explains its philosophy of reforming education, and which we are working diligently with the government of Kuwait and the Ministry of Education and the Center for Educational Development, the National Center for Education Development. The main idea is that the program links on 5 different aspects. So one of the aspects is regarding تطوير وتعزيز المنهج. I will speak in Arabic and English if that's okay, which is a curriculum reform. The second aspect is كفاءة التدريس, which is teachers reform. The third aspect is كفاءة المدرسة, school effectiveness. And of course, the fourth aspect is كفاءة ومساءلة النظام التعليمي, which is system-wide accountability. And finally, of course, the aspect of improving, educational policies. So in essence, the index here relies a lot on TIMSS results and all international testing results. And Kuwait, in parallel with all this system-wide reform, is also doing a lot to enhance the kind of preparedness, if you may, of its students and schools to take the TIMSS in 2019, which is going to happen in April. So we really encourage everybody here to take the word out to support, Ministry of Education and the government of Kuwait in terms of the upcoming TIMSS, because if they improve, the ranking, it will have a lot to do with the index too. So that's basic.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Heba. Now let's go to the question from Ms. Hala about how does a person or a child who reaches the age of 18 be productive or contributing productive. Again, in productivity, I think, let me clarify, it's being ready to be productive. That doesn't mean that he or she has to work, but he has acquired learning skills and knowledge that can make him or her productive. Whether they go into vocational training, whether they go in tertiary education, but these are sort of the foundational skills that are required to make him or her productive. So as I said, it's a projection, right? It's like the flow of, whether they will be ready. The next question is about percent of education is low. I think you're referring to the same slide, right? All right. This x-axis is the per capita income. So countries who are further to the right means they have more per capita income. They are rich countries. And this is as I said, this is the quality adjusted school of years. As I explained, it's not a matter of how many years children stay in school, but how much they learn out of these school years. And I just give the example of 2 countries with 13 years each. However, the test scores are different. As you can see, GCC countries, given their high income level, they are achieving lower results than South Korea, Japan, and United States, Russia, and so on and so forth. their results in education is similar to Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina, and Turkey, right? So this is how we measure, the low score in learning. You can help the children, to improve their skills in the TIMS education. That doesn't solve the problem, okay? You will have very, very marginal benefit. You will increase it by a little bit, because to increase the results in TIMS, you need to have the whole foundation in terms of school management, teachers training, administration, and so on and so forth, right? So this is just, again, think of it as, a pointer. It's not as comprehensive as you may think, but at least it points to a problem that you're having in the system. To address this, you have to tackle the problem systematically, the whole system, not just addressing this particular aspect, because otherwise you will not get much progress toward that result. The third question that you posed about, the role of community and community culture. Definitely. I gave the examples of risk factors. These start at very early age, smoking and lack of physical activities and junk food. We are all experiencing this with our children and relatively when we were young. And the same with cognitive ability, early child development. The brain development in the first 5 years has tremendous impact on the cognitive ability of the child later on. And this happens at home. It happens where the parents expose their children to what communities, to gardens, playgrounds, to cinemas, games. So all these exposures affect either positively or negatively. So definitely the parents, the community, and what I call the circles to which the child is exposed have tremendous effect beyond the schools, at least in the early years. So definitely there is a role for the community to affect that. Then the SDGs. Well, I think Jumana, you posed this question about, the link between the Human Capital Index and the SDGs. You have 3 goals there in the SDGs: quality education, quality of healthcare, and decent work and economic growth. So broadly defined, of course, because under there are specific targets. And indeed, if you look at the health aspect of it, adult survival and non-communicable diseases, it's part of health and wellness. When you look at quality education, this is what we've been talking about. When you look at decent work and economic growth, I think I've made the case clear about decent work or qualified labor force and their contribution to economic growth. And this is what what made the bank think of the Human Capital Project, because just working on economic growth and reducing poverty is not enough. You need to invest heavily in people. And the population. This has been a challenge all along. Whenever we do international comparisons or global comparisons, the GCC stand out because of the nature of the demographics, right? You have large expatriate population, right? Mostly healthy, mostly male, and we try to finesse, our methodology to try to actually address this aspect, but there will always remain sort of unique in that sense. There are no other groups of countries that have this, large expatriate population. In terms of countries that are aging, and those countries that have youth bulge, you can look at Japan, for example, and the number of jobs that will be lost. So unless they tackle issues related to population and other factors, it's a little bit sensitive talking about immigration there. But anyway, look at countries that have youth bulge. It can be either a blessing or a curse. in East Asia, when they had the youth bulge, they were ready with reforms in the labor market, in the economy, that was able to accommodate this youth bulge, and that's why they had tremendous economic growth at the time. And countries where you have youth bulge, but you didn't have adequate or commensurate labor market for policies, enough jobs being created, it turned into a challenge for these countries because you had unsatisfied or dissatisfied youth, and that can lead to some instability and social unrest. So again, back to human capital, it's, in my view, the most important investment that a country can invest in. I have a chart that I did not show that looked at per capita increase over the last 60 or 70 years. And in the late 70s, the per capita GDP of Saudi Arabia was higher than the United States and South Korea. But not much investment in human capital, and you can see that compared to these countries, the per capita income increase was relatively much lower than these countries because they invested on human capital rather than on relying mainly on oil. So this is a bigger question actually that requires maybe more time to address. Okay. Other questions? First of all, did I answer your questions? If there is any follow-up? Okay. More questions in the back?
First, I want to introduce myself. I'm Izdihar Al-Basri. I'm from GCC DB. I wanted to ask you because when we first came in here, we have expectation about this lecture, and it's talk about human capital, which we thought it will talk about job opportunities. And you've mentioned that there is a percentage of people who are not lack productivity in education, but I want to talk about the people who have higher education, and I don't want to make it sound like it's a high percentage because I don't know the studies, but people who have high education mostly go outside to make their full potential. Why we don't have this here in our region? Why people who have master degrees or PhDs, they always tend to go outside? This is such an important question to me. I wish you can answer it.
My name is Hazel Jassan. I just wanted to ask, what's the difference between the Human Development Index and the Human Capital Index? How do they differ? And what are their similarities? And I wanted to ask with regards to the recommendations produced by the reports. Are they contextualized for the GCC and for our countries? Because several indicators for education in Kuwait meets the mark, but when you come to the overall quality of the education, we fall behind. For example, with regards to student-teacher ratio, it's relatively low in Kuwait. Thus, the overall quality is bad.
Now, the whole notion of human capital is to look at what are those factors that make people ready to work. That doesn't mean that they will work, because on the other side, you have to have policies that will create jobs that are commensurate with the skills of these people. So there are two parts of the equation. And actually we stopped in this presentation at the labor force. Again, you may have, as I was just explaining a minute ago, that countries that have a youth bulge, so many people, young people coming into the labor force, but there are no jobs. And that leads to unrest, all immigration, migration, and so on and so forth. So, yes, you're absolutely right to have the labor force ready to join the labor market with the full potential in terms of full health, education, learning, and skills and knowledge. You also have to have labor policies that will encourage private sector development, that will encourage innovations, that will provide these opportunities Otherwise, there will be mismatch. Does this answer your question? So yes, we intentionally stopped at preparing the labor force. But again, there are labor market policies that need to be in place. Question on HDI and the Human Capital Index. Okay, the Human Development Index is much broader. It's human development. It's much broader. It has many ingredients like life expectancy. It has income in it. So income is part of the Human Development Index. So it measures something that is broader. You cannot include, if you want to look at how human capital contributes to economic growth, you cannot include income in it, because actually the hypothesis is that you want to look at how much human capital is contributed to high income or higher income, right? So the human capital is much more restricted, much more focused, and again, the premise of it, again, is if a child is born today, by the age 18, will he or she be ready to contribute productively in the economy, right? So it's one is very high, one is very focused. That's the difference between the two. The third question is about contextualizing. This is what we do all the time. You know, we cannot, I mean, at the World Bank, what we bring to the table is the global experience and expertise. But each country has its own context, its own, you know, institutions, governance structures, you know, politics, economy, demographic structure. So you cannot just take one policy that worked in South Korea or in Finland and say, okay, we're going to test it here, we're going to pilot it here. No. The whole premise of our work is contextualization, adaptation. Look at what has worked elsewhere and try to look at the specifics of this country. What are the challenges? What is the capacity of the institutions, the capacity of the public administration, the infrastructure, all of that, so that we can say, okay, fine, maybe these elements of the success can work here, but not these ones, and you start adapting them. So again, otherwise, the probability of success will be very, very low. So definitely contextualization is critical here to ensure successful implementation of any strategy. Any other questions? So do we unfasten the seatbelts and land safely? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.